What weapon defeated the samurai? For 1,000 years, the answer has been a sharper sword, a faster arrow, or a bolder tactic on the battlefield. Their history is written in blood and steel. But the ultimate weapon destroyed 1,000 years of their legacy. Oh, but no tongue. It is made of wood and lifeless computing particles. This is the tragic story of how a legendary sword fell before an abacus. This is not just a story about weapons. This is the story of a world turned upside down, where the value of honor has been revalued in terms of money, where once invincible warriors have been defeated, not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the cold numbers in the ledgers. For the next 30 minutes, join us on a journey deep into the past. We will turn the pages of forgotten history to find out how an immortal symbol of an entire nation could vanish like smoke, and why the samurai's ultimate and most terrifying enemy was the world they created. To understand why they fell, we must first peel back the myth and look at the real people. Who were the real samurai? The familiar image in movies often paints a samurai as a lonely, romantic swordsman wandering around to protect the weak. It is a beautiful, romantic image, but it obscures their true nature. The word samurai comes from the ancient word saburao, which means to serve. Their core essence was service. They were a social class, a hereditary caste shaped by war, that existed to serve a master, a lord or daimyo. This master-servant relationship was the foundation of the entire feudal Japanese social structure. Samurai was not a profession you chose. You were born a samurai, and your status within that class was very different. There were high-ranking samurai, like Hadamoto, who served directly to the shogun, lived in luxury and held great power. But the majority were low-ranking samurai. The foot soldiers lived a humble life, sometimes little better than that of a peasant. Their lives in the towns surrounding the castle were not always glamorous. During the day they practiced swordplay, studied military tactics, and performed administrative duties. They were the lord's administrators, enforcers of the law and military apparatus. Their soul was said to be Bushido, the way of the warrior, an unwritten code of honor, courage, absolute loyalty, honesty, and a contempt for death. They were taught that honor was priceless, but they were about to live in an age where everything, including honor, could be converted into money. The way of the warrior is found in death. A famous quote from the 18th century Hagakure summed up this philosophy. When defeated or humiliated, a true samurai would commit seppuku, suicide by disembowelment, to preserve his honor. It was considered a final act of purity and courage. But there is an irony. Bushido, as we know it today through books like the Hagakure, was written and codified during the peaceful Edo period. It was a nostalgic, idealistic attempt by warriors who no longer faced death on a daily basis. It was as if veterans were rewriting the heroic rules of the battlefield when the war was long gone. In the bloody Sengoku period, survival and victory were sometimes more important than honor. Betrayal and ruthless intrigue were commonplace. Bushido was an ideal to aspire to, but it was not always the harsh reality of the battlefield. Their heyday was forged in centuries of constant warfare. In the late 12th century, the Great Genpei Civil War between the two powerful clans, the Minamoto and the Taira, reshaped the entire country. The earth-shattering battles and tales of Yoshitsune's loyalty and betrayal became the stuff of countless legends. And then the greatest challenge came from outside. In the 13th century, Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire, having conquered most of Asia and parts of Europe, landed twice on the shores of Kyushu. This was the first time the samurai faced a completely different enemy. The Mongols fought like an organized machine. They used coordinated formations, poisoned arrows, and ceramic bombs filled with gunpowder that made a terrifying explosion. Their tactics were one of mass destruction and conquest. The samurai, on the other hand, fought with a strong sense of individuality. Traditionally, the bravest warriors would step forward, proclaim their names, their lineage, and their exploits, and then challenge a worthy opponent to a duel. Against the massive and ruthless Mongol army, this approach was suicidal. But the samurai adapted. They turned to guerrilla warfare, exploiting the terrain to launch nighttime raids. And then fate intervened. On both occasions, the massive Mongol fleets were destroyed by terrible storms. The Japanese called them kamikaze, divine winds sent by the gods to protect their lands. The victory cemented the position of the samurai class and created a deep belief in the inviolability of Japan. But it also sowed the seeds of a dangerous complacency. They believed that their land was protected by the gods, and that no outside force could invade. Little did they know that, nearly 600 years later, another enemy would arrive, not in sailing ships, but in steamships, and this time, there would be no divine wind to save them. Power gradually slipped from the emperor's hands and fell into the hands of the shoguns, the generals who held real power. Japan entered a new era, where the sword decided everything, and then the war ended. In 1600, after the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, ushering in a period of peace that lasted more than 250 years, known as the Edo period. Peace that was what the common people longed for after centuries of turmoil. But for the samurai class, a class born and defined by war, peace was a deadly curse, a sweet poison that slowly killed them. A warrior is born to fight. So what do when there is no more war? They become bureaucrats. The warriors who once fought on the battlefield now sit in quiet offices, processing paperwork, collecting taxes, and enforcing rigid laws. The castle is no longer a military fortress, but a center of administration. The sword, their soul, is still worn at their waist as a symbol of status, but it is rarely drawn from its sheath. The Tokugawa shogunate, in order to consolidate its power, established a rigid four-class social system called the Shinki-sho. At the top were the samurai shit, followed by the farmers nong, then the craftsmen's kong, and at the bottom, the most despised, were the merchants thuong. The shogunate placed the abacus users at the bottom of society, not knowing that those same abacus would one day decide the fate of those who wielded the sword. According to Confucian philosophy, merchants were considered a parasitic class because they did not directly create products, but only bought and resold them for profit. But in reality, they were the ones who held the lifeblood of the changing economy. The more serious problem was economic. A samurai's salary was paid in rice, which was measured in units oftry about 180 liters of rice, enough for one person to eat for a year. This wage remained virtually unchanged for 250 years, but society was changing. Cities like Edo present-day Tokyo and Osaka were booming. Commerce was booming. A complex monetary economy was replacing the simple rice economy. Prices for everything from cloth to lamp oil to basic necessities were skyrocketing. The abacus began to make noise, and its clattering grew louder than the clashing of swords. The samurai suddenly realized that the rice they received was no longer enough to sustain a life worthy of their noble status. And the tragedy began. Follow our fictional low-ranking samurai Kenshin, who lives in a corner of Edo in the mid-18th century. His salary is 50 koku a year, a considerable sum 100 years ago, but now it is meager. He must maintain his samurai appearance. His father's house is in disrepair and in need of repair. His son needs to be sent to school to learn the arts of war and writing. His wife needs decent kimono so as not to bring shame on the family. To turn his grain into money, Kenshin had to take it to rice brokers, merchants he despised. In the room, which smelled of tea and ink, there were no swords or spears, only piles of ledgers and a large abacus that sat solemnly on the table. Its clattering was a chorus of insults. The merchant, with a sly smile, would squeeze the price, minus fees and commissions. In the end, Kenshin's money would shrink again. When he went to buy the necessities, he had to pay exorbitant prices controlled by the merchant class itself. He was trapped in a vicious cycle, selling cheap and buying dear. And then the debts came, small ones at first. Gradually they snowballed. Kenshin did something his father would never have imagined. He took the family armor, which his grandfather had fought with at Sekigahara, to a pawn shop. The owner, a portly merchant, examined it condescendingly before handing over a paltry sum. It was the ultimate humiliation. His sword, his soul might be next. Kenshin's story is the story of thousands of samurai across Japan. Poverty ate away at their honor. The rise of the merchant class, the Konin, created a vibrant urban culture with kabuki theaters, Yoshiwara red light districts, and ukiyo-e woodblock prints. It was a world of pleasure and money, a world that the samurai both despised and coveted, but could not afford to participate in. It was a world of the abacus, where everything had a price. The shogunate also issued a system senkin-ki greed and need to communicate, forced daimyo lords to periodically travel between their domains and the capital Edo. This travel was extremely expensive, and to pay for it, the daimyo exploited their samurai and peasants even more, or fell deeper into debt to wealthy merchants. There were large merchant houses in Osaka that became creditors to almost the entire military aristocracy. Real power was gradually shifting from those with bloodlines to those with money. In a world increasingly dominated by numbers on an abacus, the actions of the 47 Ronin are a final roar of the sword. In 1701, Lord Asano Naganori, while on duty at Edo Castle, was repeatedly insulted by a high-ranking shogunate official named Kira Yoshinaka. Unable to bear it any longer, Asano drew his sword and wounded Kira. Drawing a sword in the shogunate's castle was a serious crime. Asano was immediately sentenced to commit seppuku. His domain was confiscated. His 47 samurai, now masterless Ronin or Ronin, swore revenge. But they knew Kira was on his guard. Under the leadership of Oshi Kuranosuke, they disbanded, pretending to live a life of debauchery. Oshi even pretended to be a drunkard, frequenting brothels to fool his enemies. After nearly 2 years of waiting, on a snowy winter night in December 1702, they gathered and attacked Kira's mansion. After a fierce battle, they found and killed Kira, cutting off his head. They then solemnly brought Kira's head to the grave of their master Asano to perform the ritual. Having completed their mission, all 47 calmly presented themselves to the authorities and accepted their sentence of seppuku. Their actions shocked Japan. They were seen as the ultimate expression of loyalty. But we must understand that their story is told and retold not because it is common, but because it is so rare. It was a last blaze of light in a world where loyalty was being replaced by bureaucratic rules and the value of money. Most other Ronin did not meet such a glorious end. They wandered in poverty, became mercenaries, or died by the barrel of wine. The rot had spread too deep. The samurai class, though noble on the outside, was hollow on the inside. They were like a giant tree with rotten roots that could be knocked down by a strong wind. And that wind is coming. While the samurai class struggles with decline from within, an unimaginable threat is brewing on the other side of the globe. For over 200 years, Japan practiced a policy of sakoku, isolation. They had virtually no trade with the outside world, except for a few limited points with the Dutch and Chinese. They lived in a time bubble, completely unaware that the outside world had changed. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe and America. Sailing ships had been replaced by steamships. Arquebuses had given way to modern rifles and artillery. Belief in Japan's invulnerability is about to be shattered. July 8, 1853, a fateful day. From the horizon of Uraga Bay, near the capital of Edo, 4 giant ships appeared. They had no sails. They moved against the wind and current, belching columns of black smoke into the clear blue sky like the legendary iron dragons. The terrified people called them Kurofune, the Black Ships. It was a fleet of the United States Navy, under the command of Commodore Matthew C. Perry. Try to put yourself in the shoes of a samurai standing guard on the shore that day. The small Japanese patrol boats, rowed by hand, looked like toys as they approached these giant floating iron fortresses. It was more than just a difference in size. It was a difference in nature. It was like meeting an alien civilization. Your entire understanding of the world, of power, of war, suddenly collapsed. Commodore Perry brought more than cannons. He brought the logic of a new world, a world driven by machines, commerce, and profit. It was the abacus armed with gunpowder. He carried a letter from the President of the United States, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade and provide shelter for American ships, and to give his request more weight, he fired his 64-pounder guns into the sea. The explosion echoed across the bay, a sound the Japanese had never heard before. The Tokugawa shogunate, already weakened and divided, was at a loss. They had no answer. They asked for time to think. Perry agreed, but announced that he would return the following year with an even larger fleet to get an answer. And he kept his word. In 1854, Perry returned with 9 warships. Faced with overwhelming power, the shogunate was forced to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. Japan's doors were flung open. A series of other, unequal treaties with the Western powers followed, including humiliating provisions such as extraterritoriality. Foreigners who committed crimes on Japanese soil would be tried in their own courts, and the loss of Japanese control over customs duties. This event sparked a decade of turmoil. The country was deeply divided. One side, led by the shogunate, believed that compromise was necessary and that Western learning should be gradual. The other side, mainly the powerful southern states of Satsuma and Choshu, advocated Sunji, the imperialist expulsion of barbarians. They wanted to overthrow the shogunate, return power to the emperor, and use force to expel foreign invaders. Assassinations and small-scale skirmishes broke out everywhere, but the expelling barbarians quickly realized a bitter truth. In the raid on Kagoshima in 1863, the Satsuma fleet was easily destroyed by the British Royal Navy. They understood that they could not fight gunboats with swords and spirit. The only way to repel the Westerners was to become as strong as they were. And so a final civil war, the Boshin War, broke out in 1868. This was not just a war between the shogunate and the pro-emperor faction. It was a war between the old and the new. On one side was the shogunate army which, although it had some modern weapons, was still bound by feudal structures and thinking. On the other were the armies of the reformed feudal states, organized and trained in Western fashion, equipped with the latest rifles and artillery. The outcome was predetermined. The Tokugawa shogunate collapsed. In 1868, Emperor Meiji returned to power and began a comprehensive reform, a top-down revolution called the Meiji Restoration. The goal was to transform Japan into a modern, powerful nation in the shortest possible time. And to do that, the remnants of the old regime had to be eliminated. And the biggest remnant is the samurai class. A series of decrees were issued at a dizzying pace. The feudal system was abolished. The daimyo lords lost their land and power. A national army was established through conscription, recruiting soldiers from all walks of life. The sons of farmers and craftsmen could now take up arms in the service of the emperor, a privilege previously reserved for samurai. Modern banks and tax systems were born. The world of the abacus was now institutionalized by law. And then the final blow was struck. In 1876, the hate-ray or sword abolition order was issued. The public carrying of swords, a symbol of samurai status for 1,000 years, was banned. Along with it, the distinctive chamage, hair top, was cut off. It was not just the disarming of weapons. It was the disarming of souls, the disarming of an entire class. A samurai without a sword was like a tiger without claws. It was the final declaration of victory for the new order. Sage Takamori, one of the greatest heroes of the Restoration, a true samurai of the Satsuma domain, could not accept this truth. He felt betrayed by the very government he had helped create. He led the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, a last desperate attempt to hold on to a bygone era. His samurai army, with unparalleled courage and superb swordsmanship, fought against the government army equipped with Gatling guns and modern artillery. It was a tragic confrontation between tradition and modernity. In the end, they were defeated. Mortally wounded and with no way out, Sage asked a retainer to help him perform his final seppuku ritual on Shiroyama Hill. His death marked the end of the samurai era, and thus the centuries-long war between the sword and the abacus ended. The abacus won, not by a duel but by an irreversible change in the course of history itself. Looking back over the entire process, we can see 3 major historical currents converging and sweeping away an entire class. First, there was internal decay. A warrior class that had lost its role in peacetime became economically isolated and exhausted. Second, there was the change in social structure, with the strong rise of the merchant class that broke the old feudal order. And finally, there was the shock from the outside. The superior military pressure and technology of the West acted as a catalyst, accelerating the process of collapse that had been simmering for a long time. Japan was faced with a crossroads: either cling to its past and be torn apart by Western powers like the Qing dynasty in China, or sacrifice tradition to modernize and protect its independence. They chose the latter path, and that sacrifice was the samurai class. So what happened to the millions of samurai and their families after that? They did not disappear completely. The samurai class died, but the people adapted. With the advantage of education and discipline, many former samurai became leaders in the new era. They became politicians, businessmen, teachers, officers in the new imperial army. They took off their armor, cut off their top knots, but retained their discipline and dedication. And what about the legacy of Bushido? It did not die. The Meiji government cleverly repurposed it. They took the core values of Bushido, loyalty, sacrifice, and contempt for death, and reoriented them from serving a daimyo lord to serving the emperor and the Japanese nation. The spirit of the sword was reshaped to serve the world of the abacus and the factory. Feudal loyalty became loyalty to the company, to the nation. That legacy is still present today. You can see it in the incredible discipline of Japanese work culture, in the almost absolute loyalty to their company of the corporate samurai, in the meticulous perfection of craftsmen, and in the spirit of martial arts like kendo and judo. And that legacy has gone beyond Japan's borders, becoming a global cultural phenomenon. From the classic films of director Akira Kurosawa to the anime and manga that have captivated millions of people around the world, such as Rurouni Kenshin, Gintama Good Vagabond, the image of samurai still lives a second life, glorious and colorful on the screen and in the pages of stories. The samurai is a reminder that, in the course of history, nothing is permanent. Change is the only rule. Even the greatest warriors, seemingly immortal icons, can be defeated not by a sharper sword, but by the ever-turning wheel of time itself. Is their downfall a price that must be paid for progress? A question that will probably never have a satisfactory answer.